Picture this, the year is 1808. The mighty armies of Napoleon march into Spain, their banners glittering beneath the sun, confident that another conquest will fall within weeks. But in the narrow alleys, in the mountains and farmlands, something unseen begins to stir. Ordinary farmers, shepherds and mothers, ghosts in the night, rise from the shadows. What followed wasn't a war of soldiers, but of spirits, a nightmare born in silence. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire seemed unstoppable. From Paris to the far corners of Europe, his armies had crushed monarchs and reshaped nations with steel and fire. When his troops marched into Spain in 1808, he expected another swift victory, just another crown for his collection. But Spain was different. Beneath its proud cities and rugged hills lay a people whose hearts burned with defiance. The invasion shattered not only the Spanish monarchy, but also the fragile illusion of control. As French soldiers occupied towns and villages, resentment began to smolder like hidden embers beneath the ashes of defeat. What emerged from that darkness was something new, a form of warfare unseen before, a rebellion of the common people. Spain's civilians would become its soldiers, its land a weapon, its silence a threat, and soon Napoleon's dream of conquest would turn into one of history's most haunting nightmares. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. When the French army first crossed into Spain, the locals greeted them with cold silence. Napoleon's generals believed it was fear, an easy submission to the empire's will, but they were wrong, it was calculation. In Madrid, the French set up their administration, replacing the Spanish crown with Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. A move that enraged the nation. The people didn't see a king, they saw a puppet. The humiliation was unbearable, and in the taverns, markets and churches, whispers of rebellion began to spread like wildfire. Imagine walking through those narrow streets at dusk, the air heavy with tension, eyes watching from shuttered windows, children hushed by parents who feared the wrong word could mean execution. The uprising that would shake the empire began not with generals but with ordinary citizens pushed beyond endurance. It started in Madrid on May 2nd, 1808. The crowd gathered outside the royal palace as rumors spread that the last Spanish prince was being taken away. Shouts turned to screams, and before anyone could stop it, chaos exploded. Civilians armed with kitchen knives, hammers and farm tools lunged at French soldiers in the streets. The French, disciplined but shocked, opened fire. The cobblestones ran red. Women dragged wounded men into doorways while church bells rang wildly across the city. That sound became the call to arms for all of Spain. The massacre of Madrid, what history remembers as Dos de Mayo, wasn't just an act of defiance. It was the spark that lit the guerrilla war, and from that day on, Spain was no longer conquered. It was possessed by fury. The French retaliated with brutal precision. General Murat's troops executed prisoners in the hundreds. On May 3rd, firing squads lined up Spanish captives against the wall, their bodies crumpling under the flash of musket fire. Francisco Goya would later paint the scene, a haunting image of fear, defiance, and death that captured the very soul of the uprising. But even as the executions continued, something unexpected happened. The more the French tried to crush resistance, the stronger it grew. Villagers who once feared the soldiers now swore vengeance. The resistance wasn't organized, it didn't need to be, it lived. In the shadows, in the hearts of ordinary people. Imagine being a French soldier stationed in a foreign land, surrounded by a language you didn't understand, faces that smiled by day and vanished by night. Every road became a trap, every meal a risk. The Spanish civilians, farmers, priests and shepherds turned their knowledge of the land into their greatest weapon. They cut supply lines, ambushed patrols, and disappeared into the hills before reinforcements could arrive. Bridges were blown up, messengers vanished, and entire convoys were found burned to ashes in the morning mist. The French called them bandoleros, but they were far more than bandits, they were ghosts. The countryside became a theatre of fear. In villages, priests blessed weapons hidden beneath altars. Women carried messages tucked inside loaves of bread. Even children served as lookouts, watching troop movements from the safety of vineyards. Each day brought new acts of sabotage. The French army, built for open battlefields, found itself fighting an invisible enemy. Their discipline became their weakness. For every town they conquered, 10 roads around it were lost to ambushes. As the months turned to years, the invincible empire began to bleed slowly, silently. But here's the chilling part. The guerrilla fighters were not soldiers, they were survivors. They didn't fight for medals or rank, they fought for revenge. Some had seen their families executed, others had watched their homes burn. Every act of defiance was deeply personal. There was no central command, no grand strategy. The resistance was chaos, but it was a chaos the French couldn't contain. It spread like a shadow, unpredictable and deadly. Napoleon himself would later admit that the war in Spain was like a Spanish ulcer, a wound that refused to heal. By 1809, entire regions of Spain were no longer under French control. Guerrilla bands roamed freely, striking where the enemy was weakest. They learned to exploit the terrain, the steep ravines of Asturias, the winding passes of the Pyrenees, the dense olive groves of Andalusia. The land itself became an accomplice. French troops would pursue their invisible foes into the mountains, only to vanish themselves, ambushed by fighters who melted back into the earth. Stories spread among the French ranks of soldiers disappearing without a trace, their uniforms later found hung like trophies in abandoned barns. At night, campfires flickered in the distance, sometimes real, sometimes decoys meant to lure patrols to their doom. Fear grew like an infection within the French army. Soldiers began to mistrust the very peasants they were supposed to protect. Even loyal Spanish collaborators faced suspicion. The war had become psychological. The line between friend and enemy blurred until no one was safe. The sound of a snapping twig could send an entire platoon into panic. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Meanwhile, in the cities, another front was opening. Secret printing presses produced anti-French pamphlets. Underground networks smuggled weapons from Britain. The church, once cautious, became an open ally of the resistance. Priests delivered fiery sermons denouncing Napoleon as the Antichrist, calling on Spaniards to fight for God and homeland. Faith became the fuel for fury. The rebellion had turned from political to spiritual, a holy war cloaked in darkness. And yet, amidst all the chaos, there was something profoundly human in this defiance. These weren't professional fighters, they were fathers, daughters and neighbours who refused to surrender their dignity. Imagine an old shepherd guiding French troops up a mountain path pretending to help, only to lead them straight into an ambush. Imagine a mother hiding a wounded rebel under her floorboards, hearing the boots of French soldiers thunder above her head. These moments, small, unseen, became the foundation of an empire's undoing. The ghost army of Spain had no uniform, no banner, no official leader. But it had something far more powerful: belief. Every act of sabotage whispered a message: we are still here. And with every night that passed, Napoleon's soldiers began to feel it. They were not fighting an army, they were fighting a nation that refused to die. By 1810, the French occupation of Spain had turned into a nightmare of endless uncertainty. Napoleon had once boasted that his armies could march from one end of Europe to the other without challenge. But in Spain, every step forward was haunted. Supplies dwindled, communication lines broke down, and morale collapsed under the invisible weight of fear. The soldiers no longer slept soundly. They dreamed of ambushes, of shadows shifting in the dark. The empire that prided itself on discipline was unraveling. And it wasn't the might of another army doing the damage, it was civilians, moving silently through forests, caves and mountains, as if the land itself had risen against the invaders. The French military structure was built for glory, not for ghosts. Commanders who had once triumphed in grand battles like Austerlitz and Jena now found themselves humiliated by farmers and millers who struck without warning and vanished without trace. In the rugged regions of northern Spain, entire battalions were swallowed by the hills. The French would march through a valley in the morning, confident in their power, and by nightfall, half their men would be dead or missing. The enemy left no flag, no uniform, no clear target, just silence and corpses. Even the proudest generals began to despair. "We are fighting shadows," one officer reportedly muttered before his unit disappeared in an ambush outside Zaragoza. But here's what made it truly horrifying. This wasn't random violence, it was organized chaos. Over time, the guerrilla bands began to develop intelligence networks that rivaled those of any European army. Farmers sent coded messages carved into wooden spoons. Women used laundry lines to signal troop movements. Entire villages became living maps of resistance. If a French column approached, bells would ring in distant towns, warning fighters miles away to prepare their traps. Even the terrain seemed to collaborate. Fog rolling down at the perfect moment, rivers swelling after sudden rains, the mountains echoing gunfire in ways that disoriented the enemy. To the French soldiers, Spain had become a cursed land, a graveyard of empire. And it wasn't just Spain that was changing. The entire concept of war was evolving. What the Spanish civilians were doing would later inspire guerrilla movements across the world, from Latin America to Asia. But in 1809 and 1810, it was terrifyingly new. Napoleon, frustrated and humiliated, poured more troops into Spain, nearly 300,000 men at one point, more than he had sent into many formal campaigns. Yet the more soldiers he sent, the deeper the chaos grew. Guerrillas didn't meet the French in open battle. They bled them dry in 1,000 small cuts. The empire's might was useless against a people who refused to fight by its rules. Imagine the fear of a French soldier stationed in a remote village, surrounded by silence. By day, the locals smiled politely, sold him bread, and nodded respectfully. But at night, that same village might erupt with fire and screams. Horses would vanish, muskets would be stolen, sentries would be found dead with throats slit. No one saw anything, no one spoke. The line between sanity and madness blurred. Soldiers began to suspect each other. Some refused to leave the safety of fortified posts. The guerrilla war was not only breaking Napoleon's army, it was breaking its mind. In the midst of this shadow war, British support began to arrive under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington. The Spanish guerrillas, though fierce, lacked coordination. The British supplied weapons, training and strategy. Together, they formed a DEA-Sun balance, the disciplined redcoats and the unpredictable ghosts of Spain. British officers often wrote of their astonishment at how deeply the civilians were willing to sacrifice. They fight as if every stone were holy, one captain noted after witnessing a village burn itself rather than surrender. This unyielding resistance gave birth to something larger than rebellion. It became a national identity forged in suffering. The French, increasingly desperate, responded with brutal reprisals. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned to ash. Civilians were executed as warnings. Entire populations were forced to flee into the hills. But these acts of terror only deepened the hatred. For every family killed, 10 more took up arms, and among those hiding in the wilderness were legends in the making. Figures like El Empecinado, the relentless guerrilla leader whose name became synonymous with vengeance. His small band struck with surgical precision, ambushing convoys, rescuing prisoners, and vanishing into the night. Even Napoleon himself would come to know his name and despise it. Imagine the toll this took on both sides. The French soldiers, once symbols of the Enlightenment's progress, were now reduced to butchers in an endless loop of killing and retaliation. The Spanish people, in turn, grew hardened by grief. The war blurred moral boundaries until no one could tell hero from villain. Yet through all the horror, one truth remained. The will of ordinary people can defy the greatest empire. The Spanish peasants had turned their suffering into strategy, their despair into defiance. By 1811, Spain was no longer just a battlefield, it was a lesson in endurance. Across Europe, whispers spread. If Spain could resist Napoleon, anyone could. Other nations began to see the cracks forming in the French Empire's armor. The myth of invincibility was crumbling, and in the shadows Spain's ghost army continued its silent work. French convoys vanished in the night, messengers were foot, undead in ravines, and outposts were swallowed by mist. Even Napoleon's marshals began to plead for reinforcements that never came. The emperor, consumed by his ambitions in Russia, could only watch as Spain drained his empire's lifeblood. And here's the twist that history often forgets. The Spanish guerrilla war didn't just weaken Napoleon, it changed warfare forever. Before Spain, wars were fought by armies. After Spain, wars were fought by peoples. The term guerrilla itself, meaning little war, was born from this struggle. It reshaped how nations viewed resistance, showing that even the most ordinary citizens could become warriors when pushed to the edge. Napoleon's empire, built on precision and power, was undone by unpredictability. The proud emperor who once dictated the fate of continents was now haunted by peasants with pitchforks and priests with muskets. By late 1812, as Napoleon's Grand Army was freezing and dying in Russia, the flames of rebellion in Spain burned hotter than ever. The French forces were exhausted, starved and hunted. The Ghost Army had done its work, not by defeating them outright, but by making survival itself impossible. For every French soldier still standing, there was a shadow watching from the hills. And for every victory claimed, there was another village rising in defiance. Spain, bloodied but unbroken, had become the Empire's nightmare, a place where ghosts ruled the night and the conquerors feared the dawn. As 1812 bled into 1813, the empire that once boasted of eternal glory was rotting from within. In the grand palaces of Paris, Napoleon's advisors whispered nervously about Spain, the ulcer that refused to heal. Reports flooded in, French columns ambushed, generals slain, fortresses deserted overnight. The war had turned into a ghost story told by trembling soldiers, a nightmare no one could wake from. Napoleon himself, Furio, us and incredulous, called it madness. How could the greatest army in Europe be undone by farmers, women, and priests? But on the battle-scarred soil of Spain, reason had long been replaced by revenge. Every burned village, every executed child, every stolen loaf of bread became another reason to fight. The Ghost Army had become an idea, one that no musket or cannon could kill. By this stage, the land itself seemed alive with memory and vengeance. The fields that once grew wheat now swallowed bodies. Rivers carried blood instead of water. Entire towns had vanished from the map, consumed by war. The French still held major cities like Madrid and Seville, but they were fortresses surrounded by emptiness. Outside their walls, nothing belonged to them, not the roads, not the people, not even the silence. The French soldiers moved like prisoners within a hostile dream. Every journey required escorts, every face was suspect. Letters home were filled with despair. "We live among phantoms," one wrote. "The land hates us." But here's the haunting truth. Spain's civilians were not simply fighting for freedom. They were fighting to preserve their humanity in a world that had forgotten it. The war had stripped away everything familiar. Homes burned, families scattered, faith tested beyond endurance. Yet even in the ashes, the people of Spain refused to break. They found strength in the smallest acts, sharing bread with fugitives, hiding wounded fighters in cellars, singing forbidden hymns in candlelit churches. These quiet rebellions became the heartbeat of resistance. To the French, they were invisible. To history, they were unforgettable. The guerrilla bands grew bolder, deadlier, more coordinated. In the mountains of Catalonia, they ambushed entire convoys, capturing weapons and redistributing them to neighboring regions. In Galicia, rebel leaders set up underground councils, organizing raids that mirrored military precision. And in Andalusia, the church became a secret communication net. Priests smuggling intelligence between villages, disguising messages as prayers. The resistance was no longer spontaneous. It was evolving into a national movement. Every night, around campfires hidden in the hills, civilians turned soldiers whispered plans that would someday rewrite Europe's fate. Meanwhile, British forces under Wellington advanced steadily across the Iberian Peninsula. Their disciplined ranks clashed with the exhausted French armies that had been drained by years of guerrilla warfare. Every battle the British fought was made easier by the chaos the Spanish civilians had sown. The guerrillas were the unseen hand that guided the course of the war, the whisper in the wind that tipped the balance of empires. When Wellington's troops marched into liberated towns, they were greeted not with cheers of victory but with tears, because for the people of Spain, freedom had come at a price too great to count. And yet, the story doesn't end with victory. The war left behind a land haunted by ghosts, not just of the dead but of the living who had lost everything. Fields lay fallow, villages crumbled, and the survivors carried wounds that never healed. Imagine a mother standing at the doorway of her ruined home, clutching a rosary, wondering if her sons would ever return. Imagine a soldier, once part of Napoleon's proud army, stumbling through the countryside, starving and broken, realizing that he had fought not against an army, but against a nation's soul. This was the legacy of the Spanish guerrilla war, a victory measured not in glory, but in endurance. But here's the chilling part. Even after the French withdrew in 1814, the war never truly ended. Its spirit lingered, shaping Spain's identity for generations. The word guerrilla, born from those years, would echo across history. In the jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Afghanistan, the streets of occupied cities. What Spain had taught the world was both inspiring and terrifying, that ordinary people, when stripped of everything, could wield the power of nations. The Ghost Army of Spain had not only destroyed Napoleon's dream, it had rewritten the rules of resistance itself. In his exile years later, Napoleon would reflect bitterly on the Spanish campaign. That miserable war was the beginning of my ruin, he admitted. He had faced kings and armies and crushed them all, but he could not crush a people who refused to submit. Spain had exposed the flaw in his empire, the belief that force could conquer spirit. The French emperor, who had once ruled Europe, was undone by shadows. Imagine walking through Spain today, along the same paths where those silent fighters once moved. The mountains still hold their secrets, the old churches still bear bullet scars, and in some villages people still tell stories of ancestors who vanished into the night to fight the invaders. They speak of them not as soldiers but as ghosts who guarded the land until the dawn. Their war was not about borders or thrones, it was about dignity, memory, and the unbreakable will to resist. As the dust settled after Napoleon's fall, Spain emerged battered but unbowed. Its people had endured famine, fear, and unimaginable loss, yet they had won something far greater than territory. They had reclaimed their soul. Across Europe, the legend of the Spanish ulcer became a warning to future conquerors that no empire, no matter how mighty, can hold a land whose people choose to fight from the shadows. And so, the Ghost Army faded back into legend. No parades marked their victories, no monuments bore their names, but their legacy lived on, in the word they gave the world, in the spirit they awakened, and in the nightmares that still haunted every would-be conqueror who dared to dream of domination. The guerrilla shadow war had done what no army could. It had taught the greatest empire on earth that even ghosts can win wars. The story of Spain's Ghost Army is not just a tale of resistance, it's a reminder of what happens when ordinary people refuse to surrender. They had no generals, no uniforms, no flags. Yet through courage, faith, and sacrifice, they turned their homeland into a weapon. Napoleon's empire, once feared across Europe, collapsed not in a grand battle, but through the quiet strength of those who would not bow. Even today, their legacy whispers through history's darkest moments, a warning to tyrants and a testament to the power of unity. Imagine their footsteps echoing through the hills, unseen but unstoppable, proving that freedom, once awakened, cannot be conquered. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see.